So,
Cool.
hello, Jonathan. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing well. How are you?
All good, all good. Really happy to have you on the Symmetrical Pod. Really excited, and I thought if we could, start things off with kind of telling us about your background and sort of how did you end up in Web3 and building Cabin DAO?
Yeah. My Web3 journey goes way back. When I was in college, my college roommate he showed me Silk Road, like many kind of like early, 2012 era crypto folks. That was my first introduction to Bitcoin. I started following and for a couple of years was sort of just like loosely following along with the Bitcoin story and the launch of Ethereum was very interested, but hadn't gone all the way down the rabbit hole yet. Then I, ended up taking a 6-year detour to Instacart, where I was a director of product for shoppers. Saw how Web2 marketplaces were built and became really interested in, what it might look like to build things a little bit differently. And so I left Instacart after the pandemic and, wanted to take some time off, originally move out to the woods and, build a cabin in the woods and write science fiction about the future of decentralized cities. And then it started hanging out with a group that we called ourselves the Creator Co-op. It was a group of independent online creators sort of exploring what we could do in this sort of emerging creator economy, which I saw as a successor to and hopefully like a different path than what I'd seen with the gig economy at Instacart. And then, invited the group of creators out to the cabin and sitting around a campfire late one night, we dreamed up this idea for a creator residency program. We ran a crowdfund where contributors, who provided donations were able to then receive a governance token to help vote on creators to come out to the cabins. And one thing led to another. And, next thing we knew, we had an online community that was really excited about this idea of starting to actually build a network city. And that's where we are today.
Perfect. I actually spoke to Greg from Collab Currency today, and
Oh, nice.
I asked him if he's got any sort of questions that he'd like me to ask, and he was really curious to get your take on like what was really the original idea behind Cabin DAO, and sort of the very interesting part of how did you get your initial funding? Because I heard there was some collab with a mirror or something like that.
That's right. Yeah. So, first of all, shout out to Greg. Got to see him out at DAO Camp last week, and really great dude. So the kind of initial to set the stage a little bit. This was May of 2021, and people were just starting to figure out some of the DAO primitives of the last bull cycle. And one of those was, Mirror was running the weekly write race and had opened up some crowdfunding tools. And this happened to be right around the time when that creator co-op group was out at the cabins that we just finished building outside of Austin, Texas. And, I knew that I wanted to find a way to get cool, weird, interesting, fun people from the internet to come, hang out at the cabins. And we saw that there was this new set of tools that would enable us to do this crowdfund for this residency program, and then, like I said, distribute a token to those people that contributed to the crowdfund and donated to this residency program, so that we could then collectively vote on who got to come out and participate. And so it was this very natural, simple use case for a DAO. And the goal wasn't like to launch a DAO. The goal was to collectively govern a residency program. And those were the tools that were newly available that allowed us to do that. And so we successfully ran the crowdfund. We had 101 donors to the residency program. We collectively voted on people who submitted applications on Twitter, and we used multi-choice, stack-ranked, quadratic voting in order to select these sets of residents to come out. And after we got to the end of the 3 cohorts of that program that we planned, we kind of took a step back and we were like, wow, well, so many people have rallied around this idea beyond those initial 101 contributors. Now we have this Discord server with thousands of people that are excited about this idea and want to continue it. And so we decided, wow, this is not just a one-time residency we've put together. There's actually something deeper here. And that's what really became Cabin.
Amazing. I had a question whether Cabin was meant to be a DAO from the beginning or did this come later, but I think you kind of answered that it came later.
Yeah, we think of the set of DAO tools as a really useful set of tools for coordination. But that's what they are, is they're tools. They're not, and so we've never, really been a fan of the idea of well, let's start a DAO for the sake of starting a DAO. It's sort of like saying, let's start a corporation for the sake of starting a corporation. You need some deeper underlying purpose. And in our case, it just happened that the DAO tools that were emerging and available at the time perfectly fit the needs of what we were trying to do.
Perfect. And, I've done some digging and I'm curious if, why specifically cabins, why building these kind of decentralized cities? I know you have in the past participated in the Boy Scout, and did that really play a larger role in this, and were you always kind of, strongly associated with spending time outdoor or in nature?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're exactly right. I feel very fortunate that, a lot of different threads of my life have found themselves weaved together here into what I get to work on now. So, what the earliest, the first thing I really wanted to do when I was a kid was be an architect. I was had this 3D architecture software, that was one of the first computer programs I used. And I was designing houses for my friends and babysitters and stuff when I was a kid. And then started spending a lot of time on online communities, particularly in middle school, early sort of the communities that were emerging around that time, like Dig and the beginnings of Reddit. Found those to be really magical experiences, and then spent a lot of my high school years and middle school years as well in the Boy Scouts, spending a lot of time outside in nature and building a really deep sense of connection with the outdoors, and also with the types of associative communities like the Boy Scouts that are how groups of people come together and create shared values and traditions and lore, and those sorts of things were really important to me. Went and had a great residential living experience at a small liberal arts school for college, where I studied complex adaptive systems and the role that small groups could play in overcoming collective action problems, which I didn't have the words at the time to call that a DAO, but essentially I was doing political science experimental research on DAO structures, and all of these things have now found their way into the way that I spend my time on a day-to-day basis at Cabin.
All right, going slightly off track. What was the name of that designing program? Was it Google SketchUp by any chance?
I have since used SketchUp. Actually, the original, when I left Instacart and decided I wanted to do a cabin in the woods, the first prototype I designed was in SketchUp. But I hate to say this because it probably dates me, but the stuff I was using when I was a kid, I think, was before SketchUp existed.
Okay, yeah, because in terms of the first attempts of architecture for me, it was either Sims or Google SketchUp, if I remember well. Yeah. I am drawing a lot of similarities between Cabin DAO and Balaji's idea of network state? Do you envision Cabin DAO becoming a network state in the future?
Yeah, it's a funny question because it's one I've been getting a lot more recently. When we first started working on this idea, and when I wrote the first essay about decentralized cities in early 2021, Balaji's book wasn't published yet, but he was definitely out there starting to talk about some of these types of ideas. What I've always resonated more with, and what I think the Cabin community resonates more with, is the idea of a network city instead of a network state. And if you look at Balaji's definition of a network state, it shares obviously a lot of overlap, like you've pointed out, with how we think about where the world is going in terms of these distributed locations that are sort of stitched together through shared culture, economy, governance structures, et cetera. I think the big difference between a network city and a network state is that states are inherently about independence. They're about territorial sovereignty, which ultimately is about the monopoly on violence, and that part just does not interest me that much. I think what we're interested in is building a network city, which is much more about interdependence. It's about building local bottom-up communities that are very people-centered and that are very interested in integrating deeply into their local environments versus some sort of sense of territorial sovereignty being at the core of the idea.
I think I like this. It's a more user-friendly version of the network state.
Totally. One thing that we like to say at Cabin is that if you want to build something like a network city or a network state, you probably should be able to throw a dinner party and clean up the dishes collectively before you go out and try to build new state structures. And I think that what we've seen in the network state discourse is this sort of ironically top-down approach to the idea of network building, when what we really believe in is community-centric bottom-up approaches to network building.
Perfect. And in terms of Cabin DAO's business model, how does Cabin DAO make money these days?
Yeah. So first of all, you've been using the phrase Cabin DAO. Just to return for a moment to this idea of DAOs as infrastructure and as tools for coordination. We tend to call ourselves Cabin. We've dropped the DAO in the same way that you don't call it Apple Incorporated. At some point, these things become pieces of infrastructure that are obviously very important to the way that we think about how to collectively govern, but are not sort of the key part. They're the tools that we're using. So. But Cabin, of course, is structured as a DAO. Legally speaking, it's an unincorporated nonprofit association, sort of like a neighborhood association that's made up of a network of independently operated neighborhoods. And so the business model is twofold. First of all, when neighborhoods in the network participate in Cabin, when they become neighborhoods, they basically gain the ability to run a set of both definancialized exchanges, these work-stay exchanges where Cabin members come in and participate as builders, naturalists, creators, gatherers, etc., as well as paid co-living. And for the paid co-living, Cabin takes a small percentage of the rent that people are paying to live at Cabin neighborhoods. And what we're now working on is rolling out Cabin citizenship. So this will be a bit of an alpha leak. More coming over the next 2 months as we approach our second anniversary in late May, where we'll be kind of fully announcing and rolling this out. But over the past 2 years, we've been handing out these chip embedded passport cards to people who've been participating in IRL activities with us. And we are working towards launching our citizenship, where holders of those passport cards, as well as original donors to the crowdfund and significant holders of the Cabin token, will receive citizenship, which will give them access to the set of both paid and work exchange experiences across Cabin's network of neighborhoods, as well as governance and some other perks and benefits that we'll be announcing soon. And the important thing about this citizenship program, versus kind of some of the other communities out there that are starting to do similar things, is that this is not something that anyone can just buy. We believe that citizenship is the most important designation of membership in our community and in our network. And so we're doing it as a web of trust. So those initial citizens that, we're going to be rolling this out to will then be able to vouch for other people to join the network. And it will operate on a subscription model where, you can pay a small annual membership fee, and that fee gets you your citizenship and all of the access and benefits that it provides.
Great. Coming back to the first things you said, it's so true, is that we kind of, in a way, have to drop the DAO. In many ways, I think someone made kind of highlighted the most successful DAOs in the space, and they typically do not have the word DAO in them. That's something that allows people to coordinate. Is the DAO, but it should be a name of its own, without the incorporated or anything like that.
Yeah, totally. We're a member of, and I'm actively involved with Seed Club and the Seed Club network. And if you look at all of the sort of like examples of communities featured on the Seed Club website, none of them use the word DAO. And I think in the same way that there was this whole era, this like brief era in 1998, 99, where everybody was suddenly a .com. It was like Amazon.com. And now everybody just calls it Amazon. I think it's going to work the exact same way.
The .com bubble and the DAO bubble.
Exactly.
Yeah. I read that I absolutely think that like narrative is so important with these communities. And I was reading up on Cabin's website, and there was this very cool sentence that Cabin is like playing an RPG game in real life. Could you tell us more about this?
Yeah, definitely. This is, I think, one of the most exciting parts of where we're headed. And I think with the this rollout of citizenship and our community census and our city directory in the next 2 months, this will become a lot more clear to people where we're headed here. But yeah, the idea is that Cabin is the first global IRL RPG in real life role playing game, and that what we are doing is helping people. As you're starting a game, the first thing that you do is you choose your character, you choose your role, and for us, we have a set of roles that are also the guilds within Cabin, which are the groups of people with specific skills, knowledge that can contribute to building our network city from the ground up. So this is people who are physical builders of housing and amenities at our neighborhoods. This is naturalists who are building regenerative permaculture systems at neighborhoods. This is creators who are coming out to participate, much like they have since the original creator residency program. This is gatherers who are people who create the social fabric of our neighborhoods and bring people together to break bread over dinner, and caretakers who create new Cabin neighborhoods. So these are all different roles that we're developing, and that we are decentralizing within the organization in order to create paths for people to start playing a game together. And that game is a civilization building game. But instead of, like Sim that you're playing on your computer, we're starting to do it in the real world. And, we're seeing kind of the early examples of what that looks like to bring people together in this way and build physical environments at real neighborhoods. And we'll continue to lean into this metaphor and to make it more real over time. And I think, we're seeing the beginnings of how some of the DAO native composable tools like HATS protocol, outer space badges, start to allow us to create the reputation and identity systems that are feeding into our community census. We're adding a new game that is our way of selecting neighborhoods via our city directory, which is essentially a token curated registry. And we're going to keep layering on these, games that use Cabin, our token, as a sort of in-game currency that allow people to develop and up-level their reputation and identity within the community, and that allow us to coordinate, not just online, but increasingly across physical locations where we're starting to rebuild civilization from scratch.
Super cool. Yeah, by speaking to you, I'm even more interested in somehow getting involved. But that kind of, really brings me into another question: is how many neighborhoods are there currently at Cabin? Is it 2 or is there more?
Yeah. So yes, we have kind of 2 places we've been operating as neighborhoods. One is Neighborhood 0 outside of Austin, Texas. The other one is Montaya Base Camp, which is a beautiful spot right on the edge of the Sierra Nevada in California, basically just outside of Yosemite, which also has gigabit internet. It's a really incredible place. But we've been, kind of prototyping and testing with these couple neighborhoods as part of this launch and rollout that I've been talking about with the census, citizenship, and the city directory. We're actually going to be opening up the aperture on Cabin neighborhoods with our city directory. And so the city directory is a place where anyone can go and list an outpost in the Cabin network. And, we've been cultivating relationships with hundreds of potential neighborhoods over the past 2 years, and this will be the first time where we'll be bringing on a select set of those as outposts, and then token holding members of the community will be able to curate that list. And so rather than having some sort of like centralized process for deciding what is a neighborhood, what we're going to do is put it in the hands of the community. And anyone that holds Cabin will be able to use it as this kind of in-game currency to vote on potential neighborhoods. And we'll have a stack rank token curated list of all of the neighborhoods in the network. And then those neighborhoods will be able to offer work-stay exchanges and co-living experiences, both on a paid basis and, for specific roles, like I was just mentioning, that will allow people to come out and participate, live for free in exchange for, sharing their skills as a builder, as a naturalist, as a gatherer, as a creator, et cetera, within Cabin neighborhoods.
Interesting. And is there any plans of cabins in, neighborhoods in Europe by any chance?
Yeah, great question. We have a strong European contingent at Cabin. And we actually, by popular demand, we just brought back the Cabin in Europe channel in our Discord. There's been a lot of interest in Cabin neighborhoods in Portugal, in Italy, in Germany. And so while I can't share any like exact details, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves with the upcoming launch. But yes, there are definitely some folks who are very interested in developing Cabin neighborhoods in Europe. And while we've started out with a strong contingent based in the United States, the goal is absolutely to grow a global network so that members of our community can live, work, travel around the world, and always be home at Cabin.
Perfect. I can't wait. If there's going to be one in Europe, then I definitely have to visit.
Yeah, we'd love to get you out there.
Yeah. I think, one thing that I'm trying to understand with various community builders, to avoid the word DAO, is sort of how decentralized is Cabin. Even personally at the Symmetrical, we try to, we're decentralized to a certain extent, where whenever there's any expenditure from the treasury, that should be up to everyone's vote. But I'm curious, how does Cabin do it? How decentralized are you, and what decisions are being made on the level of the core team, the founding team, and what decisions are sort of outsourced to the whole community?
Yeah. I think decentralization means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And we've gotten ourselves in I think, a pretty big trap as a DAO community, even just with like the words decentralized autonomous organization. I think what's important in my mind is actually polycentric governance, which I think is the most important form of decentralization. And what I mean by polycentric governance, I think is best expressed by looking at the way that this sort of like next wave of DAO tooling primitives is building composable pieces that allow for contributors to have a high degree of delegated autonomy within specific sort of like zones of context or expertise. That's very abstract. So let me try to like make that really specific in the context of how we think about it at Cabin. So a couple of versions of progressive decentralization that we're pursuing. The first one is the one that's like most typical among DAOs, which is just like resource allocation, via like a standard governance proposal process. This one I think is actually like the least interesting one in the long run. But it's the one that, kind of all DAOs start with, because you have to bootstrap from somewhere. And the way that works for us is, we have a standard snapshot voting process using, in our case, quadratic voting, sometimes multi-choice, that allows anybody with over 1,000 Cabin to create a proposal, form a fellowship, and then for that fellowship to become a pod that is receiving funds in order to pursue work on behalf of the DAO. But I think what's actually more interesting is new forms of decentralization that are not just sort of built around a yes/no like proposal capital allocation process. So I'll provide a couple examples of those. One of those is how Cabin thinks about roles and guilds. And so every one of those roles that I was just talking about in the context of the IRL RPG is structured as a guild, which is represented in our case through HATS protocol NFTs. And that's a form of decentralization in which, the person who is best suited to describe like who's met the qualifications of different levels of a builder are other builders. And so that's not a decision that like the entire organization should be making. If somebody gets to become a builder, that's a decision that the builders themselves should be making. And same goes for the naturalist creators, et cetera. And so we've been using, HATS protocol as a way of doing that. Another good example is the token curated registry, that represents our city directory. That's not like we went through a period where we were like, oh yeah, we're going to do sort of like the standard DAO thing with proposals and yes, no votes and whatever. Where we've ended up is like, okay, well, let's just create a very scoped game where we can collectively use that game to curate and decide, which neighborhoods get to be a part of the network. And so you can see this is like a polycentric governance structure where it's actually like a decentralization of the types of governance. And the goal is to put the specific decisions in the hands of small groups of people who have the most context within, that sort of scope of decision making.
Yeah, this is so true. I think this is basically taking the early ideas for how DAOs should be governed to a completely different level. And it's so right, even comparing it to sort of legacy structures, is that people that sort of have specific knowledge on a matter should be the ones deciding it, and the power in terms of, builders deciding whether someone should be a builder should be kind of delegated to them. It shouldn't be up to a DAO. So I'm incredibly impressed that you've already added these like extra layers of decentralization and who chooses what. Super cool. Thinking about fundraising, you haven't accepted any sort of venture capital funding at Cabnin.
So we do have some strategic partners who have contributed, money to Cabin through treasury diversifications. Something that, we are proud of is that we've taken a very different approach to this than most other organizations have. And so I can talk for a minute about kind of the structural elements of that approach that make Cabin different. The first thing is that, so I came again from a traditional kind of like startup Web2 world and saw how this worked in that context where basically what usually happens is you have founders who have some, huge portion of equity in a company. And then you have investors who are also taking a huge portion of equity and typically getting like these very extractive terms through the investments that they're making, with all sorts of like preferences for those investors. That depending on how the company does, like they may get certain multiples on the benefits of their equity and things like that. Okay, that's like the typical structure. And what I think is special about, the opportunity that online communities have, that DAOs have, and that Cabin pursued, is that rather than having, even any type of equity structure at all, what Cabin has is just a tokenized governance structure. And, since the beginning, when we first launched the residency program, it was built around a token with an explicit purpose of governance. And that is the only form of, power within the organization that we've ever distributed. And so while we brought in, some money through treasury diversifications in order to make sure that we could pay contributors in stablecoins, we did it in a way where everybody was on the same terms as members of the community. So everybody received the same governance tokens, and in particular, the founders, myself included, have very small portions of that overall token allocation, and most of those tokens are held by the community itself.
Great. So flipping around the sort of traditional model in Web2, where communities get nothing or almost nothing, and yeah, I love that.
That's right.
Do you think it's still possible to raise for a community? That's something that I've been thinking lately a lot about. Is like last year DAOs were like a very hot thing, and is it still feasible to raise? Community fundraise is possible as long as you have the right mission, but how about accepting institutional money? Do you think there's a place for that? Or do you think DAOs should inherently be these organizations that raise for their community members?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just in terms of market dynamics, I think we were very fortunate to do treasury diversifications when we did, and to have the ability, based on the strength of our community, to structure it in the way that we did. That's not a typical thing. And I hope it becomes a more typical thing in the future. But for now, given the current market conditions, I think you're absolutely right that it's an uphill battle for communities to do this kind of thing. I see both sides of this, both as a contributor at Cabin, who led these treasury diversification processes, but then also as an advisor for C Club Ventures and Hydra Ventures and some other funds. I see a fair amount of kind of the other side of it, and the reality is, of course, that we are in a not just like a bear market overall in crypto, but I think particularly like a DAO bear market and a DAO tool bear market. And like, nobody wants to put money into those things right now other than a couple of the real OGs who understand where this stuff is going and that it's cyclical and the opportunity here. So all of that is to say, I think like any community is going to have a hard time right now. Finding capital from any source really. But that, I think these things are always cyclical. Like I said, I've been watching these cycles since around 2012 and they're just so consistently, fractal, right? Like we've been through these very fractal cycles where you see the same pattern every couple of years repeating itself in the markets. And I think what I'm seeing, at places like DAO Camp is a lot of builders who are still around and are learning from the last cycle and working on really exciting new primitives that allow us to start solving for the reasons things didn't go as well last time. And so I'm very confident that we'll see that the promise of DAOs is still there, and that it's just going to take a little bit of time for new communities and new applications to get built on top of the kind of new set of primitives that we now have available.
Okay, and now first of all, fingers crossed for the bull to return. But I want to go back slightly back to Cabin itself, and curious if you sort of envision a future for Cabin neighbors where the monetary system is entirely based on crypto and blockchain. Do you think that's feasible, and how close are you to this future?
Yeah. So you said the monetary system, and I actually want to unpack that a little bit because I think the first decade of crypto was about cryptocurrencies. And it was about monetary systems, and that'll be an important part going forward. And in fact, I think if anything, what we're seeing right now with what's happening with the Fed is a pretty good indication that like crypto will play an increasingly important role in financial and monetary systems at the like existing nation state level, maybe even faster than some of us would have imagined. But that's not the part that gets me most excited. The part that actually gets me most excited is thinking about blockchains in the context of governance and identity and reputation, and how communities can scale community infrastructure. And those things are inherently non-monetary in nature. If you look at what makes communities work, it's actually definancialized exchange. It's like relationships of mutual debt that is not paid. It's like relationships of, like letting your friend borrow a hammer, or your neighbor, borrow a hammer, and then they like give you the proverbial cup of sugar, and like those sort of things that are definancialized, or even, to take it up a level, the sort of definancialized work stay exchanges that we're building at Cabin. I'll cook dinner and you do the dishes, right? These sort of like core experiences of co-living and community building and relationship building are not about money. And I think that's a really important part of this, is that we need to not just create cryptocurrencies, but create on-chain systems that allow us to better build definancialized community structures.
Okay. Okay. So you're not thinking of Cabin becoming, the currency for, at some point to, I think I'd think of this as once these decentralized cities get more developed, then suddenly people might be offering certain services, and at some point it might not be as efficient to have these exchanges of I'll do this, I'll do that. Did at any point in your mind did you have an idea of like Cabin becoming the token itself becoming this medium of exchange?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I don't know is the honest answer, right? I think like so far we have focused on the role of Cabin as a collective governance mechanism and as this sort of like in-game, in-game currency, in-game points system that we can use for making collective decisions, like what becomes a Cabin neighborhood. That's where I think we've found the best like product market fit for the token so far. But if you think about what a city is a culture, an economy, and a governance structure. And so, we've started thinking about the token primarily in forms of the governance structure. We've started thinking about the like definancialized exchanges and how that can build a community. At some point, we will also need to like think more about what it looks like to bootstrap the economy. There's a great book by one of the best thinkers about urban planning ever, Jane Jacobs, called Cities and Their Economies. And what she talks about in that book is the idea of economic growth being the core of what makes a city, and the sort of root of that economic growth coming from something called import replacement. And import replacement is basically the idea that you start out importing things in, and then you figure out how to create those things yourself and start exporting them. And so something that I've been keeping an eye on and thinking more about is like, what are the things that we are importing, and what are the things that we're exporting as a community? And while that's still very early, I think like that starts to point in the direction of how the economy will start to scale.
Exciting to see how will this roll out. Could imagine different neighborhoods specializing in specific services or producing certain things, and having even these exchanges in between neighborhoods is something super fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that happens culturally as well as economically. I think you'll start to see, these pockets of like you said, people specializing and then cross-pollinating, both in terms of the culture and in terms of the sort of goods and services that can be exchanged.
One question that I really haven't planned, but I'm curious can you see differences between the two existing neighborhoods in terms of the profile of the person that comes there? Does each neighborhood attract a slightly different type of a personality, or is it pretty similar?
Yeah, definitely. So, we really have more examples beyond those two neighborhoods to pull from. We've spent the past year doing pilot programs across, additional neighborhoods. So we've done Build Week in Puerto Rico, a Grow Week in the Portuguese Azores. We've started exploring what it looks like to build out neighborhood partnerships with other places in Idaho and Costa Rica and all over the world. And I think that like absolutely every neighborhood or potential neighborhood has its own flavor, and that flavor is determined by the geographic location. It's determined by the caretaker who's creating the neighborhood. It's determined by the types of stays and offerings that neighborhood is providing. And so we're still very early to like see clear cultural differentiation. I think at this point it all still feels like one Cabin community. But as we grow, and particularly as we deepen our identity and reputation systems, I think what that will allow us to do is scale the vibes beyond the sort of like immediate network of people who know each other. And so, if there's if I'm at Neighborhood Zero and we're interested in bringing in a naturalist, and that naturalist, is somebody who has achieved our like artisan naturalist designation through work that they did at Montaya, then that's somebody who I'm gonna, even if I've never met them or heard of them or anything, I'm instantly gonna be like, oh wow, like that person passes my vibe check. Like they should come out to Neighborhood Zero. And so I think that sort of like loose network of associative reputation and identity will allow us to start to scale pockets of culture across neighborhoods more effectively.
Cool. I know we've touched upon like dropping the word DAO, and I think that's kind of something that makes the project interesting to a much broader community, because I think the value proposition of Cabin is not just Web3 people. But I'm curious, sort of what is the plan for Cabin to onboard people that aren't necessarily familiar with crypto?
Yeah, it's a question we've thought a lot about, and a really important one, because first of all, like most people want nothing to do with crypto right now. I think that's just like a reality we have to acknowledge. There was a lot of goodwill that was burned in the last bull market, and a lot of people who got scammed or lost money or whatever. And I'd even say like probably 95% of like crypto stuff was like net negative for people. And so that's like a fundamental reality that we have to address. And I think the way that we try to address that is by using the tools where they are useful. And, basically not like talking about them where they're just infrastructure. And so what we're excited about with, for instance, the census, the community census that we're rolling out, it's built on top of all of these Web3 primitives we've been talking about. But if you just log in, other than, the fact that you do need a wallet, you don't have to sign any transactions or pay gas or, even know that these things are NFTs or tokens or whatever. And I think like that level of abstraction at the app layer is what is going to make Web3 actually usable for most people.
Okay. Yeah. Kind of Web3 in the background is necessary to reach mass adoption. That's for sure. To finish things off, before we go into the funny part of this podcast, what advice do you have for Gen Z DAO builders?
Yeah. Man, first of all, like we've had a lot of, I'm a millennial. I'm like a very, middle of the road millennial. And so over the last 2 years at Cabin, it's been the first time I've gotten to like really deeply interact with Gen Z. And we've had a lot of Gen Z folks, come out and live with us and spend time with us at various events. And I got to say, I'm a big fan. Like, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I just feel like, like Gen Z just like gets it in a way that, like I like, God, this makes me sound so old, but like, I remember the first time I used the internet. I remember the first time I used a computer, and those were like big, exciting moments of my childhood. But just the fact that Gen Z like is so native. Like people called us digital natives, but we are not. We got onboarded onto that. And I think like the extent to which Gen Z is legitimately like digitally native is still underappreciated. And so like, my advice would be just like, do whatever you find interesting and exciting, because you have the skills and the sort of like very, digitally native mindset. And there's such an insane amount of cool stuff starting to blossom right now, just as like Gen Z's hitting kind of like the most important career growth years. And whether that is, getting deep on DAOs or, generative AI or whatever. Just like find whatever the little pocket is that gets you the most excited. For me, that was governance, and that was collective action problems, and that was online communities, and that was residential living, and like finding a way to weave all of those things together. What gave me a lot of meaning in life. Whatever that is for you, like whatever little pocket just like gets you really excited and gets you up in the morning and wanting to just like build stuff on the weekends. Just lean into that and you'll have a great time, and it'll probably be pretty great for your career as well.
Great alpha there. I'm glad you like genZ. I think we actually do have some overlap in terms of community members that are members of Cabin and the Symmetrical. Nice, yeah. They seem to be pretty happy with Cabin, actually. Cool. So it's time to move on to the weird part of this interview. Yeah. Something you mentioned that at some point that if someone passes your vibes check, and we want to see if you can pass the genZ trend check.
Uh-oh. Probably not, but let's give it a try.
Let's give it a try. It's a hilarious part of this. I've had very funny answers. I had Flex Chapman lately on with some nice. Great answers, and also Anthony from Seed Club Ventures with their answers. So I'm really curious how will you answer. So starting off is, what is your favorite trend on TikTok or Instagram Reels, as you're a millennial?
Oh my God. Well, so first of all, I don't use TikTok or Instagram Reels. So I'm going to probably swing and miss on this one. I'm like a little too terrified of TikTok, both for its level of addictiveness and its level of management by the Chinese government. And I never really got into Instagram. I'm a Twitter only kind of guy. So I don't have a lot to contribute to this one, unfortunately. But I did really, the one like TikTok trend that I like downloaded the app for and actually went and like watched all of the things for was height of the last bull market, the like crypto boy like knockoff versus. That was the first time I was like, oh wow, okay, I like get what TikTok is about, and it is pretty fun.
Okay, good. That's a pass. Moving on, what is your favorite genZ behavior? Something that you see that genZ has as a behavior that perhaps other generations don't.
Yeah. I love the touch grass meme. Like, I think touching grass is just like, it's such a great phrase, meme, and activity. And I think it like speaks to Gen Z's combination of ability to memify everything and to like do the technology in a way that also understands the like limits or sets its own limits of like exposure to the technology. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Touch grass is definitely a sort of a powerful statement in Web3. I was actually this weekend in the mountains in the south of Poland, and I did a remix of that, touching snow at that time.
Yes.
Lovely. Now, last question. So to give you sort of more of an understanding, like Gen Z is anywhere between 2009 and 1997. That's kind of a typical age range. What is the sort of ultimate Gen Z artifact for you? Something that in those times was big and...
Yeah, 1997 to 2009. Man, those were good years, you know? There's a lot of good stuff that happened there. Yeah, you know, I think so the question that I like to ask to like differentiate Gen Z from millennials, it's actually two questions. So I'm going to flip this back on you for a minute, and see what your answers are to these. But the two like differentiating questions in terms of cultural artifacts that I like to ask are, one, did you ever do T9 texting?
Never.
Do you know what T9 texting is?
Is this like a pager thingy or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So So back in the day before smartphones, there was this thing called T9 texting, which is like when you had your little flip phone, which was like in that era, like the kind of late, 2000s. You in order to make texting faster, they had this thing called T9 where, because you just had the numbers 1 through 9 and each one like had a couple letters associated with it. And so it was like the first predictive texting thing where you'd like hit the numbers. God, this makes me sound so old. And like it would predict what words you were trying to text and fill them in because we didn't have full keyboards. Anyway, that was like a great thing from that era that was actually terrible, but is a good way to differentiate Gen Z from millennials.
And what's the second question?
The second one's a little darker, which is just, do you remember 9/11?
I do. I actually do.
Okay.
And I was actually talking to well, it's just a very sort of short memory. I was actually speaking to my mother about it because I wanted to see if I'm actually remembering it, or because there's this thing that people can, like, you have these childhood memories, but they're very much often like it's actually your imagination. And right. I was actually following up with my mother last week, talking to her about 9/11 because I told her, like, I remember it happened. I was at like my grandparents' house, like you weren't there, and I was sitting on the couch, not on the couch, on the carpet. When the TV was on, and I remember like my grandfather getting like really stressed about it, and I actually checked out. So I do remember that it has happened. At that time I was 3 years old.
Okay. Well, I think you might have just passed at least part of the millennial check there, because I think that's a very classically, millennial early trauma memory is, I was sitting in a classroom and, they used to have these like big televisions that they'd roll in on wheels. And they like brought in the TV with the planes crashing. So that was, yeah. Anyway, that's a very millennial memory from that era.
So yeah, probably that shows for that I'm an elder Gen Z. I'm just right at the cutoff point. That's why I get to see these. I do remember these phones that had these keyboards. I think just because Poland is not as big of a country, we didn't have these suggestions for the words that you're trying to type. But I do actually remember that. Nice. That was fantastic. And I have one last question, which is kind of relating back to Balaji, but I decided that, like, because it's such a big event in crypto, I want to hear everyone's thoughts on that. And like, do you think Bitcoin will hit 1 million in already under 90 days?
Yeah, no, I don't. I think this bet, that Balaji did is such a classically Balaji thing where, it's like, it's both like kind of right and totally wrong at the same time. I actually feel the same way about the Bitcoin bet that I do about network states, which is like the basic premise is like sort of right. There's like this crazy, amount of like Fed debt being held by banks, and like technically they're sort of insolvent because of like increasing interest rates and the value of those bonds, and like the fundamentals he's talking about are there. But like, does this mean that Bitcoin is going to be worth $1 million in like 90 days? No, absolutely not. That would be an insane outcome. And I think like very similarly with network states, it's like you read his definition, it's like, oh yeah, like 95% of the kind of core definition here makes sense. And then you've just like tacked on this like kind of crazy part at the end that invalidates a lot of the rest of the stuff you're talking about. So anyway, I have held a little bit of Bitcoin since I first saw Silk Road back in the day, but I am definitely not like transferring all of my assets into it right now.
Okay, cool. Super. Great. Well, Jonathan, that wraps everything up. Great podcast. A lot of amazing answers, great insights into Cabin and just generally into your mind. Tell us, how can we get involved with Cabin?
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Really appreciate you having me, and just love the symmetrical vibes. So appreciate it. If you're interested in getting involved with Cabin, you can head over to our website, cabin.city. hop into the Discord, introduce yourself, join one of our welcome calls, and choose your role and begin your adventure in real life role playing game.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Jonathan. This was a pleasure to have you, and
Yeah,
enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much. Take care.
Bye.